Okay. How are you?
I'm well. These
Are
work,
these on?
yes? Do we need
Can you
them?
hear? Are these on? These aren't on, are they? Are these on? They are on. Are you sure?
Yes?
No, you can. Okay, it's much better.
Better.
Yes, it's like radio. Well, the first time I ever saw you was on stage in Burn This, and that was the first time I got a chance to see your concentration. I mean, I think of you as being a sort of fiercely concentrated actress, and that part really demanded that, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It was it was a long play. It was it was like 2.5 hours or something, and I was on stage most of the time. Almost, yes, for almost the whole time.
I got tired just watching you, and I wonder how you. I'm so aware of you physically. I mean, you're bearing and. Do you have a workout and an exercise regimen that you do when you're about to go to work on something?
I have at various times in my life. At that time, I was in my 20s. I didn't really need to work out as much. I was playing a modern dancer, and I studied. I just watched how dancers move, and I was kind of genetically thin, which was to my advantage. And I've worked out more as I've gotten older, to stay in shape. And kind of fell off the workout wagon a little bit recently. But, I live in New York, and we were just talking about how much of a walking city it is, and you get a lot of exercise that way. But, yeah.
You've worked with so many different kinds of directors. I mean, the list goes from Michael Mann to Ang Lee to Oliver Stone to Paul Greengrass to Gary Ross. And each of these directors is, in his way, the kind of person people often think is being intimidating, just because they tend to make very demanding works. And obviously, these guys seek you out. What do you like about working with really demanding directors?
Well, I love the actor-director relationship. It's just I like the collaboration of it. And particularly in film. Maybe because I did so much theater for so many years. First, I felt like it took me a while to understand how film works and how to have an emotion and hit your mark and have all this chaos going on all around you. And I really felt like a close connection with the directors to have that precision and create the character. Maybe even more so than with my fellow actors, even though that was very obviously very important because in the moment it's really a play back and forth. But I really liked having a very strong director that I felt like was on my side and felt like I could believe in and talk to and would talk to me and help me explore and understand things.
It's interesting because you seem, I'm not going to say seem, you're such a confident performer. The idea that you were finding your way in film seems kind of unusual to me.
Well, I think my confidence has come mainly from my original ensemble training, being part of a theater company. When I finished college, I went immediately into a theater company in Chicago, Illinois, and it's called the Steppenwolf Theater. And it was an incredible training ground. It was an ensemble of about 8 or 9 actors. We picked our season every year. I knew I was going to be in plays 1, 3, and 5. I had a lot more security than a lot of actors do, and I was working with the same actors over and over again. And it was just, Chicago also was a very no-nonsense city in terms of performance and theater.
And audiences.
And audiences. It's very grounded, very down to earth.
And audiences would talk back to
Yeah,
shows.
they will. They will. They don't make a big deal out of it. It's very workmanlike sort of approach. And so it was a really humbling sort of non-ego kind of way to be introduced and to become hopefully better at what I was doing. And I got to do it over and over again and work with and make mistakes and do some roles better than others. It was really on the job training. And I think that that created for me a real foundation. It gave me the opportunity to become better. I was working with incredible people. They, I think, made me better. And our approach really was, the most important thing was about the story. The emphasis was, with every play, how can this story best be told and how do we serve the story? So it was a very kind of egalitarian experience. All the actors we felt on very equal footing, and I think it just gave me a sense of confidence and strength and thinking that the story is really the most important part, and how does everybody work on that and serve that. And I just sort of carried that then when I was started working with people who had, more bigger names and were more, well known and in the world.
As you say this, I was thinking your first big movie, Manhunter, you're surrounded by theater actors. You have Tom Noonan
Yes.
and Billy Peterson, these guys who come, Peterson from the Chicago stage.
Yes, exactly. Dennis Farina, a lot of, Michael Mann was the writer, director, and he's from Chicago. I think originally spent a lot of time in Chicago, so he loved Chicago actors too.
But I just thought that must have helped too, just being in a film at a time when maybe you're still figuring things out with stage actors, so you must have felt that sense of
Yes.
camaraderie with those guys.
Yes. I think I'm very grateful for all my stage experience. It did take me a while to learn how to work with the camera, but I wouldn't really trade it. I think that the experience of just approaching a character and storytelling was very well served by, kind of these just very basic beginnings and approach.
It's funny because one of the things I think I really like about you so much is that as a character, you tend to contain your own narrative.
Yes.
And your characters are trying to explain themselves in ways that are helpful. Even your Pat Nixon is trying to sort of explain herself a little bit, which I think is a really interesting way to work.
That's an interesting observation. I had never really thought about it quite that way. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's cool.
I hope that's
like
right.
that. I like that.
But that's hearing you talk about story. I just wonder if, as a stage performer, you create a story for yourself that ends up lending itself to the characters you play.
Well, I think I try to create, something of a story, a backstory, understanding where this character came from originally, what their past is to a degree. So a lot of times that's in the material itself. And I really see the script is incredibly important to me in terms of just the blueprint of the material, which then can lend you to thinking, oh, well, the character says this, but what does that really mean, and what did that mean to the character before, and how have they evolved, and what kind of person are they, and it all kind of comes from there.
But you know what I mean, though, that because so often when actors appear on screen, they seem to come out of nowhere, and I was just watching things to get ready. Your introduction to Manhunter, you're explaining, well, I'm blind, but I started hearing I did this and this and this. It's like, but it's not like somebody explaining backstory. It's just a kind of a almost Chicago, no-nonsense-like way of doing that.
Yes.
And then I was thinking about, there's a great scene in Face Off when you're with Nick Cage, you have to tell him you've been with somebody who wasn't your husband. And that also becomes like a piece of emotional storytelling. I mean, it's fascinating to me the way you find these ways to grasp these 2 or 3 lines and make them feel like a narrative.
Well, there often are, in a screenplay or with any character that I play, there usually are like a few lines that kind of anchor or explain, are kind of key, and so maybe those, become evident when you see them as an audience.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't mean to push this, but I do feel this is something that's specific to you.
Yes.
I'm not trying to make you blush or anything, although I am.
I don't know if I understand.
It's a good color for you, blushing. It looks good on you. But there's obviously a love of storytelling that must have superseded your beginnings as an actress.
Yes, I think that that's true, but like I said earlier, with the Steppenwolf, all those years, all in my 20s, I only did theater. I came to film relatively late. I was in my late 20s when I did my first film. and I just think that training ground of the emphasis being on the story and how can we best tell the story and how does my character serve to move the story forward in a way that hopefully is meaningful to an audience and is true. Um, I think I just kind of was surrounded by that.
But also, when you're talking about Chicago theater, now I would go to Chicago theater when I was in high school and college, and it was an intensely competitive, both for keeping the audience attention because you had to prove being up there in front of those audiences. It was real working class theater.
Yes.
And I thought that theater was going to transform Broadway. And for a bit it did because so many of you guys came. But
Yes.
it was you had to basically there's a demand that you keep the audience's attention because a lot of them weren't people who come to theater a whole lot. There's
Yes.
also a sense of competition on stage that kind of a friendly competition. I thought it was a remarkable thing to watch at Chicago theater.
Yeah, I think that it really had kind of uh, braveness or vitality, and that was pretty unique. And I think that that actually still carries on there to a degree.
Do you go back to see theater very often?
Well,
there?
I just did a play there last fall. I've only done 2 plays in the last 22 years, and I did a play there last fall, which it's called The Wheel, and it was the first show that I had done back at Steppenwolf for over 20 years.
What was that like?
It was fantastic. It was just a brilliant play with a brilliant director who happens to be sitting here with us right now. She's right there. Tina Landau directed it, and it was. Sometimes there are moments when the right material comes at the right time in your life, and I felt that there was a synchronicity with that particular piece. I hadn't been on Steppenwolf stage for many years. A lot of that was because my daughter was growing up in New York, and felt like I couldn't leave New York for 3 months to go do a play. It's a big, long commitment, and now she's 20, and I felt like I could explore that again. And it was the right play with the right director, and a time in my life where I felt like celebrating in certain ways, and I think it reflected in the work and the piece. So I had a really incredible time.
Was it scary to go back to the stage?
No, it didn't scare me at all.
No.
No, it was really exhilarating. It felt like riding a bicycle, and I just felt completely comfortable from the beginning of rehearsal. I'd done it so many, many, many years. Starting in high school plays in my little hometown in Illinois, and all throughout my 20s. I've done so many plays, and I've had some life experiences now. When you live to be a certain age, you have sometimes some kind of tough things to live through, and sometimes scary things, and I just felt that compared to some of the things I'd lived through, the theater was kind of, it's like this is nothing to be scared about. There are things in life to be scared about, that I had been scared about, and this was like, let's just get up there and do it. Get up there and do it. It's okay. I had kind of like a very Zen approach to it. It meant everything to me. I placed it in my head like this means everything, and it means absolutely nothing. And it placed me it released me then to be completely, I think, unafraid. I was really, I think, unafraid the whole time. But I also saw it as an ongoing rehearsal, that I said, there is no opening night for me. It's just, it was a complex play, rather abstract. It demanded a lot of an audience to watch it. And I just felt like I was a constant rehearsal. I would say to my fellow actors before we'd go on stage, have a good rehearsal tonight before we'd go on. Wow. And it just felt like something that you would keep working on, and I enjoyed that part of it as well.
Well, that's got to be one of the things I want to say for this audience, because they may not know. The great thing about Steppenwolf and all the Chicago theater was that it was down to break down that boundary that said theater is this precious thing, which is what Broadway had become. prices had gotten really high, and it had become basically almost like an opening night kind of thing in Broadway. Whereas Chicago, I think, was really like get your fingernails dirty, roll up your sleeves, sweat
Yes.
on stage, expenditure of energy. For me, it was like what I imagine what it must have been like seeing the Actors Studio in the 50s.
Probably.
Real excitement from the actors, which translated to the audience. And you hearing you talk now, you're basically evoking those same kinds of things, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah, it was the also the risks weren't as high. I mean, Chicago economically, it's more viable to do theater there. Real estate is cheaper. I mean, it's in New York. The stakes are. It's real estate is very expensive, and to do a play is a big risk and a lot more investment, and it costs more to rent the theater, and so it's harder to take risks in some ways. I think in New York, and somewhat easier in Chicago. It's a little more freed up that way.
What was happening in New York at that time too, which I think sort of increased the financial risk, because there are a lot of sort of like big concept shows that are going up in that period, and
Yes.
the feeling was that a lot of New York's shows had lost touch with actors. I mean, there's a period of Big River and Frankenstein and all these crazy shows that had these big sets that had kind of lost touch with what theater was supposed to be. And what was happening in Chicago is the sets were almost abstract in some of these shows.
Yes, we had one critic say in the early days the set ran into the tens of dollars. that was a quote. 'Cause it really wasn't about that, you know.
It wasn't about that. It was almost it was really about material and performance.
Yes, and story. Yeah,
And
exactly.
and I can't help thinking that so many that sort of sense, that kind of storytelling that you're talking about is something that you respond to when you see a script. When you see the script for the contender, you go, well, I can play her because I know there's a story there. But it's not just this self-contained story.
Right.
It's a narrative that touches everybody.
Yes, yes, and that script in particular, that character was written for me, and. That play, that film is very ensemble. You know, even though my character is quote unquote the lead character, but it's barely. I mean, Jeff Bridges and Gary Oldman. I mean, all the parts in it were. It felt like very much an ensemble film to me while we were doing it, and I'm all about ensemble. You know, I have been from the beginning.
Because all these things that you've done, you know, Pleasantville is basically an ensemble piece.
Yes,
Absolutely, isn't it?
absolutely.
And that must have been something that you found attractive about that piece of material
Exactly. Ice Storm, very ensemble.
That's almost like a play ice.
It is, yes, yeah. And I love being part of a group that's telling this, you know, that it's a group effort. I really enjoy that.
But also in Ice Storm, you're working with another stage actor. You're working with Kevin Kline.
Kevin Kline was in that, and Sigourney Weaver was
Weaver
also
again?
on stage, and yes.
I mean, at a certain point, it almost feels like you're. I'm not here. I can't take that call right now. At a certain point, it's going to feel almost like one of the things that you end up doing is finding these pieces of material that connect you to, that make a continuum for you. I mean, has that been a conscious choice for you now, or?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I mean, because you know, you do a piece that's an ensemble piece that has stage actors in it. The next piece kind of has that too. And
yes.
Bill Macy in I mean, you've done so many things that've had like sort of stage actors in them.
Yes, I have. But I think, you know, more and more actors are kind of bouncing back and forth between stage and film again, and so it's an interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think that is the case.
But I think there's always been a kind of actor in this country that's unusual. In Europe, it's more the norm than in America. Actors going back and forth between stage and screen, but you've always struck me as being that kind of actor for whom the material seems to be key, rather than just finding something that's a showpiece for you.
Yes, I think that is true. I'm interested in the whole story, and I think even more so. You know, I just that continues to be really important to me.
Because even in I've got to ask you because you were in working in the Bourne movies. You're working with somebody. We working with Paul Greengrass, who first and foremost is a former journalist and a
Yes.
real agitprop journalist, a guy who's using the action form as a way to ask questions about authority. And
Mm-hmm.
you're the fulcrum.
Yes.
You're both the authority figure and the audience surrogate who has to be educated about something.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. There are some people that have responded to that character and saying, "Boy, what a bitch she was." And I was like, "What do you mean? She's just doing her job and she's trying to figure it out. And she actually would, be on his side maybe if she understood what's actually going on." I never really understood people who have that response to her just because she's a strong woman. I guess I don't know.
But she's also initially an archetype because she's kind of part of the apparatus. I mean, she comes in that way that you often do. You're the mission. I'm doing this and this and this. Oh, that's Joan Allen. Well, I know who the character is. She's told me her story, and now she's going to play that all out.
Yes.
But that is almost a mislead the way we're introduced to that character, because
Yes.
she does seem like she's got this mission, but in fact, again, she's in. It's a twofold purpose, and so much what Paul Greengrass has done as a filmmaker has been about finding that person who's both a figurehead and who has to be educated. And you
Yes.
get to be that in a real way for the first time for him.
Yes, I did. I did.
What kind of discussions did you guys have about that part?
Well, that was a really interesting process to make that film because there were we often didn't have a script. It kept getting changed all the time, and we would shoot. One of the I think in Bourne's Supremacy we shot 4 different endings, and it was a very interesting, you know, process and yes.
I'm sorry, forgive me.
Yes, I would fly back and forth between New York and Berlin, and I would, before I'd come back, because my character worked, that film shot like 7 or 8 months. They just kept shooting and reshooting, and I would contact Paul before I go back and say, "Paul, should I bring my script?" And he said, "Oh, darling, how delightful of you to ask. Of course you shouldn't bring your script. We're still working on it." And I would fly to London, fly to Berlin again and go, "Okay, what are we doing?" But the basic character was there, but it was the script, changed a lot, and Universal would fax things and say we're going to do that scene, and so it was interesting.
And I hate to use the word legacy, but it's kind of a legacy, watch this, born out of the first film, which was in a lot of, how best to put this, transition, the first film.
That's my understanding that the first one was, yes, and it was re-edited then, and it was, yeah,
They shot a whole of the film they didn't use, kind of like what they did in the other movies.
yes, yeah. I think maybe that was the way they thought to approach it. So,
But it's in this weird way because it almost feels like that has to inform you as a character because with all these things going on, you've got to know who you're playing, don't you?
well, yes, and actually that character was in some ways more mysterious to me, playing, what is a person in the CIA? Do we know them? Are they walking, or am I brushing elbows with them in the subway? I mean, it's a very mysterious world, and I found it in some ways maybe one of the harder characters that I could connect to. And I went to Washington, D.C., and I actually met with a woman who was retired, who was very high up in the CIA, and I had tea at her house, and she could tell me some stories because they were so old at that point, they were declassified, but it was an intense world, and a very complicated world, and I just kept hoping, I'm like, I hope I'm getting this right.
It's funny because I think of your characters as being, I don't want to make this reductive, but kind of these two people, they're the people we meet, and then the person who emerges at the end of the movie. And that sort of transitional character, or the character in transition, I should say, is clearly something you're attracted to, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, characters really should have an arc, hopefully, that they start in one place and then things happen to them and there's a dramatic thrust to the story and maybe to the character, and hopefully that's what's compelling is you see somebody change or something happens to them and they have some kind of transformative experience, to some degree or another.
But these characters have been, I think, women who have been waiting for something to make them change, and we introduced them at the point where that trigger happens, that catalyst happens.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
you could say that, and I keep thinking about Pat Nixon, who uses what's around her as her time to make a stand and change because she
Yes.
won't be this person anymore.
Yes. Well, things happen to her that change her. There are a lot of things that have occur that she has to negotiate and navigate and figure out, and they do take a toll. Being his wife. I mean, and I read some biographies on her, and she had a, it was a tough life in a lot of ways. Yes, I had a lot of compassion for her, really.
It's interesting because I think of that as being the one great female character Oliver Stone has ever written.
Yes.
Because generally they just kind of stand around and they're appliances or something. But
Yeah.
she is the person. I mean, she finally sort of stands up and goes, "I'm not going to be
Yeah.
Pat Nixon
Yeah.
anymore."
I give him a lot of credit because I agree that he doesn't, women characters for him are not really his, yeah, they're not. They're not well drawn. And he had to do speculation in terms of Pat Nixon because there was not a lot of
There's not a whole lot of books
materials
about her,
like what did Pat and Richard Nixon talk about when they were having dinner together? I mean, well, who knows? And so there was some speculation with guidance from some people who were in the White House who were consultants on the film, helped to sort of would discuss with me. Alexander Butterfield was on the set all the time. I remember when John Dean came on the set. And we were able to have some conversation. Alexander Butterfield was the liaison often between Pat and Dick, and so he said there would be some kind of a state dinner, and Richard Nixon would say, well, I want this to eat, and I want this kind of music, and then Alexander Butterfield would take it to Pat, and she would say, well, yes, no, and he said, I don't know. It was like, why aren't they talking to each other about it? Why am I the one that has to be the go-between? But it was very. I had the opportunity to talk with him, and I'm sure Oliver did as well. But he took it very seriously, what this woman was, and what they possibly talked about, and he he would sit down and talk with me about this is believable, and he really invested thought into it, and I gave him a lot of credit for that.
Was that on the page, or was that something that happened as you came on and you guys worked through things and you found the character?
It was pretty much. I don't think the script changed all that much from originally. He really stuck to it. He stuck to a schedule, and some people have said that he takes on the nature of whatever film he's shooting. So if it's Natural Born Killers, he was like out there. But Nixon was he was very contained. He was very on schedule. He was very accessible to me. He was patient, and I had a good working experience with him.
And you got to work with another former stage actor in that piece.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Again,
Anthony
see, you
Hopkins.
see what I'm saying about this continuum?
Yeah.
These things where you find somebody who's a stage veteran.
Yes.
Again, that must help the relationship too, because
Yes.
somebody who goes as far back in the theater as he does,
Yes.
you have real actor conversations about how these two characters relate and don't relate to each other.
Yes. I think you can with actors who've had more of a theater background. You can have more maybe conversations about, in-depth character conversations, because in the theater you're used to, you get to rehearse for a month and you get to explore the characters and talk about them and dream about them, and so you kind of get used to approaching a character kind of in that regard because you've had the luxury of being able to work on it for so long.
And with you and Hopkins, and that's weird because, again, it could be like a chamber piece almost. It could have been a play. There are so many two-character scenes in that.
Yes.
It's just the two of you in the room. I mean, it's almost like watching Christopher Durang at some point. I mean, it's because there's so much that's not being said.
Yes.
And if you push it one step farther, it's satire. But and if you play too much in the nose, it's also satire. I mean, because it's slightly surreal.
Yes. Yeah. You have to, I guess it just felt very real to me. I felt he was very believable, and I just believed that I was Pat Nixon, and I'd done the research, and I practiced her voice, and, you kind of come with your toolbox, you come prepared, and you've got your tools in there, and you try to, you utilize them to best effect.
But some of these characters you played, have had kind of a moment, a big epiphany, and we get to see a physical change in those characters. In the 90s, it almost this sort of streak of you playing these characters who are either informed by politics or political characters. You know, Pat Nixon, or your character in Pleasantville, or your character in The Ice Storm. I mean, political changes inform these characters, and we get to see these women be very different to the contender. That's almost for me like this sort of period of these movies where these are all women who have a place in the world and informed by politics, or a character in Pleasantville is still informed by politics, even if she's not quite real.
Exactly. Yes.
And you must have loved all those characters.
Yeah,
too.
I did. Well, The Crucible, actually, I think.
Oh my God! Well, no,
that
that's
fits,
the most political.
That fits into it as well.
That's
Yeah.
real. That's a metaphor, but it's the blacklist.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And that again, that is a character that goes through, has to make a big decision about, is she going to continue the way she's been, or is she going to take a leap and decide to do something that's very risky and scary, but.
But with all those characters, though, each of those characters does do that and often suffer for them. Pat Nixon's change is small. I mean, it's still a statement in the way that each of these characters you played. Now, I think each of those women you like because they do make a statement in a way by the end of the film.
Yeah.
Pat Nixon's is so small.
Yes.
Was that a hard sort of transition to make because it was so small?
No, it didn't. It didn't feel. No, it didn't feel hard to me. I appreciated the scenes when she does sort of put her foot down and say, in her own way to say no. But she didn't, from my understanding of her later in her life, she didn't change radically her personality. But it was just, she had a lot of things to field, and I think she didn't particularly enjoy living in the White House, and there were things that she didn't like to do, and she wouldn't do them. She wouldn't do them. She was the gal who was sitting there writing, she would do handwritten notes to people, but she wouldn't, go out and create like Lady Bird Johnson, Beautify America. She wasn't that person that was going to create like a whole platform campaign, that was the First Lady's,
Yeah, she's
banner,
And she'd been surrounded by, the First Lady before her. You had Mamie Eisenhower, and there was Eleanor Roosevelt. These women who did have these.
Yes, exactly. She was not that cut out of that cloth.
Wasn't allowed to be that person.
Yeah, and she wasn't, but I don't think she actually was either. I think in her own nature, she was a caregiver from a very young age. She lost her mother at a very young age, then her father, then she, in high school, was taking care of her father and her two brothers, and then when she was a junior in high school, her father got cancer, and then she nursed him until he died. So she became like the mother of the household from when she was like 14 or 15 years old, and cooked and went to school and took care of her brothers and her father, and then he was sick and he died. And, there's people come out of places, they have life experiences, and that helped me to understand her. I think a lot of people in America, were very disdainful about her. At that time period, and Plastic Pat, and she's just, standing there waving. But when I studied her life, I like, this comes from somewhere. This isn't coming out of nowhere. And it actually, like I said, it gave me a lot of compassion for her.